Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the SPJ. My name is Bruce Gellerman, and I am delighted to be here tonight with Marvin Kalb. Marvin Kalb is the Edward R. Merrill Professor Emeritus at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. He's served as moderator of the Kalb Report, public broadcasting series since 1994. He was the distinguished broadcast journalist for 30 years, career at CBS News and NBC News. He served as chief diplomatic correspondent and chief of the Moscow Bureau during the height of the Cold War. Mr. Kalb was moderator of Meet the Press and later served as founding director of Harvard's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. And, oh, by the way, along the way, he's written, I guess, something like 18 books, and was my favorite distinction here, Mr. Kalb. You were on Nixon's enemies list.
That's right.
I should have put that first, actually. So we're here to talk about Mr. Kalb's illustrious journalism career and the future of our news media industry. Marvin, spasiba bolshoi, and thank you for joining us. Как дела?
Okay.
Well, you've had an amazing career. Not bad for a kid who grew up in the Depression to immigrant parents from East Europe at the turn of the 20th century. You lived in the shadow of Yankee Stadium in Queens. I guess you're a diehard Yankee fan to this day. Is that right?
I am definitely a Yankee fan.
Okay.
I like them this year especially. They're doing quite well.
Oh, yeah. Well, nobody's perfect, Marvin. I'm here in Boston. So you've been an eyewitness to so much of the last 70 years of history. I want to go back to the very beginning, even before you really kind of were a journalist. You were taking photographs. I guess you were just a young teenager. You were taking photographs on Lido Beach in New York. Do you know, did I read that right?
No. The Lido Beach Country Club was, maybe still is, for all I know, a very fancy place that a lot of people with a lot of money went because they didn't want to spend time in Manhattan. And so they ended up in Long Island, and it was a beautiful beach and a beautiful place.
Yep, I know it.
And I was I was there for two jobs. One of them, I was a waiter, and we did quite well. And then, what was the other time? The other time I was the editor of the Lido Beach Register, which was a 4-page newsletter that was put out by the hotel itself. And what my responsibility was to fill page 3 with photographs of things that the clients were doing. And one Friday night, a man came over to me, spiffed up, beautifully black-tied. Because Friday night, the women wore magnificent gowns. The men came in for the weekend. They were in a black tie. And a guy came over to me, stuck out his hand, reached mine, and I felt there was something that he had put in there. And as he was holding my hand, he said, "Have you met my daughter, Natalie?" I said, "Yes, of course. I know her quite well." He said, "But you haven't put a picture of her on page 3. I said, "Well, I haven't done that yet, but maybe I will next week. But thanks you for the idea." He said, "Fine, it's a good idea. Do it." Then he walked away. I looked in my hand and it was a $50 bill.
Whoa.
This was in 1948.
Whoa.
A $50 bill was a heck of a lot of money. And the then thing I did, rushed to the phone and I called my brother, who was then working for the New York Times, Bernard Kalb. I said, "Bernie, my God, what am I supposed to do?" He said, "Return it. Return it immediately."
What did you do?
I returned it, of course, my brother. I did whatever Bernie said to do, I did. And but of course I did put the picture of her in the following week. No, I mean, it was a heck of an experience. It was my brother's ethical sense that he had developed internally but then was reinforced by the Times. And he was taking the standards of the Times and putting it into the Lido Beach Register.
Not a bad lesson.
Not a bad lesson, but I did take photographs. I did. Yep.
You went to City College, right? In Manhattan,
City College.
right? And you had a career there. You were like what, sports editor of the.
I was the sports editor of the campus newspaper, and I lucked out because the year that I was the sports editor was the year that the City College basketball team won both the NCAA tournament and the NIT tournament, which no school had ever done or has ever done since.
Whoa, big deal.
So it's a big deal in the history of City College basketball. Nat Holman was the great coach of the team at that time. And there are wonderful stories about that, but I don't know. I could go on forever talking about basketball at City College.
The year they won, they beat Kentucky. Do you remember that?
About what? I'm sorry.
They beat Kentucky.
They sure did.
And-
89-50.
What is that?
89-50 was the final score.
They whooped them.
Hang on a second. Hang on a minute.
All right. I'll do the live action commentary here. How's that?
Take a look at this.
Let me see. Oh, you got it right there.
This was it.
5 plows.
I keep this in my office because I will never forget that day, March 15th, 1950.
But here's a group of 5, or City College kids, beating Kentucky. That's fantastic.
Well, it was a fantastic night because Kentucky came in as, without any doubt, the #1 team in the country. And they looked down upon City College. They thought they could beat City, and there was every reason to believe that they would. But there was a haughtiness about the team. They were all white. They might not all have been blonde and blue-eyed, but they were very much like that. And at City College, we were, for the most part, the team consisted of 3 blacks and 2 Jewish kids. And we had a kind of inferiority complex, but at the same time, a complex filled with self-confidence and a determination not to let these guys beat us.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And Nat Holman said to the team just before they were going out to play, and he did this deliberately to put something in their heads. He said, guys, you're going to go out, you're going to be playing the best basketball team in the country. What I want you to do is shake hands with each guy. Just before you get going, just reach out and shake hands with them.
Sure.
Well, Floyd Lane was a rangy, really skinny black kid who played great defense, scored in the range of 10 points a game. He was not a great scorer, but great on defense. And he stuck his hand out, and this white giant looked at him and turned his back on him. He would not shake hands with a black player. And Floyd Lane looked at this guy and he said, man, you are going to be picking cotton in the morning. And he held this #1 scorer to 9 points in the entire game. And City College started like a house on fire. And within a matter of, it's written down, within a matter of 10 minutes, we were ahead by 20 points. And there was no question who was going to win. And it was a stunning, like the other day, the Knickerbockers lost to Indiana. And the Knickerbockers had never been beaten this badly in a championship game, but they sure were. And that's what happened to Kentucky.
Mhm.
They went home with their tails between their legs because they had been beaten by a team of blacks and Jews, and they couldn't tolerate the idea.
You never played basketball, right? You're tall. You're like six,
Three,
what?
6'3".
6'3". Tall. You never played basketball, did you?
No, I did play basketball,
Oh.
but I started at City College, but um, I don't know, something happened. I got a cold or pneumonia, something, and I couldn't play for a period of time. And when I came back, other guys had moved in and they were infinitely better than I was. So that was the end of my basketball career.
So we'll see. You were born in 1930. That makes you old.
That makes me 2 weeks short of my 94th birthday.
Whoa. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
So you went to City College, then you went to Army, right? This was in Korean War.
No, what happened, I then went to graduate school at Harvard, specializing in the Soviet Union, the language and lit and politics and all of that.
Did you speak Russian at that point?
I had begun as a senior in college to study Russian, but I was not good at it at all.
What was the language? Your parents were from Poland, Tsarist
My
Poland,
father was from Poland, my mother was from Kiev.
and both were Tsarist Russia previously.
They were victims, yes, very much so of Tsarist Russia. Yeah.
And they left early in the early 20th century, right?
My mother left first in 1913 and my father left in 1914.
Mhm. So you didn't speak Russian at home?
No.
None. Huh. I always thought you had. So you went to Harvard. For some reason, you went and studied Russian and Russian history. And then?
I studied Russian history and the language and the literature. And after I'd been up there for 2 years, I went into the Army for 2 years. And I was given an opportunity to go to officers training school. And the thought of being in the Army for longer than the 2-year period did not appeal to me. And I said no. I stayed there for 2 years, then went back to Harvard and was given an opportunity to go to Moscow at the embassy in 1956. I stayed there for 13 months. I really learned to speak Russian then. And when I went back to Harvard again, and was going on for my PhD when I got a call from Merrill, and he was the one who introduced me to journalism.
Edward R. Murrow called you up when you were at Harvard. Oh, that happens all the time.
No. It was a total fluke.
I mean,
what happened very briefly was the Russians in April of 1957 did their first public opinion poll of young Russians and what it is that young Soviet Russians were like. And the point behind it was that the Russians were going to put out a poll demonstrating scientifically that 99% of Soviet youth loved communism. Everything was great. And there was a whole lot of nonsense, of course. And you could, if you knew how to read the Soviet press, and that is what I had been doing at the embassy in Moscow, there was a way of reading it. There were certain phrases, certain words that meant more than the word itself. And I had learned how to read the press, and I knew how to read that poll. And I did an article for the Times magazine. And Murrow on a Sunday obviously read it, and he called me Monday morning, but I did not believe that Merrill was calling me. So I asked the librarian to please tell the man who called me, thank you very much, but goodbye. And she came back late in the afternoon and said, Marvin, that same man is on the phone, and he still says he's Edward R. Murrow. Would you please just talk to him for a minute? So I said, well, to myself, what the heck, why not? And I picked up the phone the minute I heard his voice, which was so distinctive. I felt like a total jackass and began to apologize profusely. And Murrow, being Murrow, was very calm, contained. Don't worry about it, Marvin. I have something I want to talk to you about. Could you be here in my office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning?
That was New York.
I said, where are you? He said, 485 Madison Avenue. I said, I'll be there. And I took a late night train, stayed with a friend, and was there with a freshly ironed shirt. I looked as good as I possibly could. The secretary escorted me in at 9. He was sitting behind his desk. I remember, there was a huge map of the entire world behind him. And he got up, shook hands. I sat down opposite him. And he then began to ask me one question after another about the poll and what it demonstrated about Soviet youth. And I tried to answer every question as well as I could. And the secretary had said that we had 30 minutes. And we went for 3 hours. And at noon, she came back and said, Ed, you have a lunch and you're going to be late. And he said, I couldn't stop. And he came around, he put his arm around me and said, thank you very much. How would you like to join CBS? This was, totally off the wall. I had no idea. It just wasn't in my head. And I said, can I think about it? He said, of course. Take a minute. And I took about 10 seconds and I said, absolutely, yes. And that's the way I got into the business.
It's unbelievable. Did you knew he was a legend in his time?
Oh, no, I was a great fan of Murrow. I listened to him every night. He had a program at 7:45, 15 minutes. I think The World Today with Edward R. Murrow. And the first 8 minutes were hard news. And then he had a 2-minute commercial and then a 3-minute commentary. And it was so labeled. And after I started at CBS, and by the way, I started working for WCBS Radio, which is the local affiliate in New York.
Right.
And I was on the midnight to 8 a.m. shift. And I didn't know anything about writing radio copy. And there was a wonderful man named Halter Kell, an editor. He taught me, and I slowly, or rather quickly actually, worked my way up. And Merrill was the one who allowed me to write commentary for him when the issue concerned the Soviet Union or communist China. And I would write this for him and he would read it. And I don't know what your experience is as a journalist, but I can tell you that listening to Murrow read my copy was one of the great thrills of all time.
It's the voice of God of journalism.
Yeah, and it was just fantastic. And he was the one who, after I'd been doing this for a while, he said, I got an idea. Yes, sir. I always said, sir, by the way. Yes, sir. And he said, I would like you to read your own copy. I'll introduce you. And so out of the blue, he presented this proposition to me, I can only tell you that I was trembling. And he said, don't worry, just sit down and read it. You wrote it, read it. And I did, and he said that we're going to send you to Moscow.
Wow.
Because I'd never done anything on air. I had no idea how my voice would sound, no idea how it would look, any of that. And Merrill sort of rolled the dice with me, and knowing that I was essentially a sort of scholar in training. I was not really a scholar, but I was trying to get the PhD. I was very close. And I would have been teaching Russian history, and that was a serious thought in my mind. And then Merrill came along, and then he sent me to Russia, and I arrived there in May of 1960 and stayed for 3 years and have been back 20, 30 times since.
One of my favorite stories, I was reading one of your 3 biographies, actually, and you factor in Russian history. The biography, I think, is called The Year I Became Peter the Great.
No, the year I was Peter the Great.
I was Peter the Great, right? Well, that's pretty
The year
good.
I was Peter the Great is a story that goes back to Nikita Khrushchev. Remember Nikita Khrushchev?
Sure, of course. Well, I'm old enough to remember Nikita Khrushchev.
Yeah, well, Nikita Khrushchev, for those young people who are around, was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1954 to 1964. And for a good chunk of that time, I was in Russia, the first time for the embassy and the second, third, fourth time for CBS. And the person I was covering more than anyone else was Nikita Khrushchev, who was about 5'5" in height and width. He had, he was bald. He had a striking sense of humor, very tough. He spoke like the peasant that he was, and but he did try in his time in office. He did try to humanize the Soviet Union. He did try to take a dictatorship, a horrible dictatorship run by Stalin. He died in 53, then Khrushchev came along and picked it up. And in 1956, Khrushchev did one of the most remarkable things for a communist leader. He went before the 20th Party Congress and denounced Stalin. And Stalin, who had for 29 years been called the greatest genius of all time, brilliant man, led us through World War II, all this positive idolatry. And Khrushchev came along and said, no, he was a murderer. He was a gangster. He was a horrible man. He almost made us lose World War II. And that was a very courageous thing that Khrushchev did, because he was taking on the entire Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
Were you
to have been there at the time and to have measured as best I could the reaction of the Russian people, the way in a marketplace, because I spoke really good Russian then, in a marketplace, you go in, you talk to somebody who is a peasant selling his fruit or whatever. And it was amazing. If you spoke Russian, they would talk to you. And because I spoke Russian, they didn't think I was an enemy. And I got some of my best stories just talking to people. And they would answer me. After a while, it wasn't, if you got through the first 2 or 3 questions, then you could reach out and the Russians would reach back and you could have a serious conversation. And I had many, many, many of them. And they admired but also still feared Khrushchev and felt maybe he's up to some mischief. Maybe he's going to, if I say something bad about him, he's going to put me into prison. There was,
But you had
it
a
was
very,
a very difficult place to live in.
but you had a close, seemingly close recurring relationship with him. And that's where you got the name Peter the Great.
Yeah, well, what happened was that at the July 4th party in 1956, Ambassador Bolin, who spoke Russian fluently, received word from the Kremlin that Khrushchev and his entire Politburo were going to come to Spaso House, the home of the American ambassador, and celebrate July 4th. No Russian leader had ever done this before.
Amazing.
So Khrushchev was sort of breaking barriers, and he came, and the ambassador told me to look out for Marshal Zhukov. Marshal Zhukov was the defense minister of the Soviet Union. He was a great World War II hero. He was a hero in the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Leningrad, and one of the great heroes.
And you had been a private, let's remember that.
And I went over, I greeted him, and we walked in the back of Spaso House. The garden was set up beautifully for the holiday, and there was a very large table with hot dogs and beer and whatever goes with July 4th. And I said, Marshall, would you like to? And he looked to me as if somebody who had missed lunch, because he ate 2 hot dogs almost that one at the same time. And then he said, do you have something that I can drink, not beer? I said, may I suggest vodka? And he said, yes. And I had a deal with Tong, who was the ambassador's man about town. He did anything the ambassador wanted. And I worked out a deal with Tong that if Marshal Zhukov wanted vodka, absolutely serve him the vodka, but serve me water. Both look the same, right? So Tong came over with a tray full of vodka on one side and water on the other. And he had it in such a way that Zhukov had to take the vodka.
And you got the water.
Had to take the water. In about a half hour, and I do not exaggerate, he had about 6. In Russian, "Stoda," which means that you belt it back all the way.
Sure.
The
Russians have an expression. They have an expression saying, meet me under the table. That's the toast, right? They shoot it back.
The equivalent of Dodna. And he would sock it back like that. Then Khrushchev waved for us to come over. And Zhukov was a little tipsy. And he held me by the arm, and we approached Khrushchev. And Marshal Zhukov said, Nikita Sergeyevich, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian. Khrushchev loved that. And he looked at me and he said, how tall are you? I said, I don't know how I thought about it, but I did say, I am 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. Peter the Great was 6'7". And Khrushchev listened to that and thought it was so funny. He burst into laughter. The whole Politburo burst into laughter. And then he and I had a conversation about basketball. Nikita Khrushchev knew basketball. He exaggerated it, but he knew it. And so he and I had a conversation about basketball. And every time he talked to me, he would refer to me as Pyotr Veliki, Peter the Great. When I went back to Russia as a journalist, and he would see me. That name meant so much for me as a reporter because he would call me over and I could ask him questions. And in those days, you didn't just, get to talk to the leader of the Soviet Union. You had to be damn lucky to have been Peter the Great. And I was, and it was a terrific opportunity.
It's incredible that serendipity seemed to play a role in so much of your career. Would you agree with that? Chance, fate.
I think there's a little bit of luck, but there's an awful lot of hard work. I think you know that yourself. You don't, in this business, you don't become the Moscow correspondent simply because Edward R. Murrow had a liking for you. You had to know something. And I had been teaching Russian history at Harvard. I knew the subject matter. I spoke the language. It was, Murrow wanted somebody in Moscow who was not dependent on interpreters or history, who knew it. And I had worked for, in graduate school for 5 years and undergraduate, and constantly reading, living there for a while. So I sort of fit the model that he wanted. But if I had not been there, I wouldn't have had the opportunity. So luck plays a big role, but luck plays a role, in my judgment, after you prepared for it.
So we're talking to Edward R. Murrow. We're talking about the last person, actually. You were the last of the Murrow boys. You were the last one he hired.
I was the last one that he hired, yeah.
Yeah. So
but to be clear about it, most of the people he hired, he did during World War II.
Right. Right.
With me, he hired me 10 years after the end of the war.
Right.
So, it was a different kind of thing. But he did hire me, and that was because of that 3-hour conversation that we had.
Well, we could go on for 30 hours and talk about your past. I want to talk about the future and the way you perceive the media today, the news media. What's your...
That is a very rough question.
Yeah, it's a very, very rough industry. I feel like it's undergone a revolution and not necessarily a good one.
Well, we've had a technological revolution.
Absolutely, of course, absolutely.
And the technological revolution has led then to a commercial revolution, which then led to a sort of spiritual revolution, by which I mean journalists learned that if they can get something on the air quickly, it didn't have to be right. It had to be first. If you had your big scoop, you would be praised, and you would be then open to other opportunities. And I can tell you that the entire industry has undergone a revolution that leaves our democracy as a large question mark. I don't want to say, and I don't want to leave the impression that journalism is the reason for it. Journalism came along for the ride. The changes that have taken place in American society affected journalism in a very big way. And we are now living with the consequences of it.
I worked at NPR in the early 80s, so it hadn't been around very long, and it was undersourced and had high ambitions. But we used to joke that we did yesterday's news tomorrow and call it perspective. And I always liked that, I really did. And then it became a primary news source, right? It felt that it needed to be. They didn't even have newscasts then. I helped start the first newscast at NPR, and in that speed to have it first, something dramatically changes in the equation. We're all rushing, and now, of course, 24/7. I mean, it's 48/14. I mean, it doesn't stop. It doesn't matter. You can't even catch your breath, and let alone read an entire article. It goes. It's a headline. That's it, and that's your news consumption. But what about the attacks that the media has? I mean, so that's internal to the industry. What about the external attacks? I mean, there's a guy running for president now who said that the press is the enemy of the people. I mean, I find that extraordinarily disquieting. I mean, not just disquieting.
You have every right to be. A couple of years ago, I did a book called Enemy of the People that was based on what it is that Trump had said. And I did a little exploration before writing. And the expression, Trump did not know the expression. He did not know that it in any way had to do with fascist and communist leaders of the 20th century. Mussolini started it, picked up by Hitler. Mao Zedong did it in China. Stalin did it in Russia. These were dictators who considered the press to be an arm, a propaganda arm of the party in power. In other words, they did not consider the press to have any independence whatever.
The party or the person in power.
The party of the person in power, correct. Correct.
Or
and this is when he thought about it, when Trump thought about this, it was in the third week of his presidency. And I remember it because I was going to be doing a talk that night at the Cosmos Club in Washington. And I had written a speech. And a friend of mine called me, and a friend of mine who was working at the White House, by the way. And he said, the president tonight is going to call the press the enemy of the people. And I know that you're going to be doing this talk, so you ought to bear that in mind. I said, the president is going to use what expression? He said, enemy of the people. I said, is he aware of the history of that expression? He said, I don't know. He said, I simply know that's what he's going to do. And I thought you ought to know that. I said, thank you very much. I threw out the speech and just ad-libbed 30 minutes on the history of the phrase enemy of the people, what it meant, and what it could mean in an American context. And one of the people in the audience asked me to do a book on that subject, which I did. And that came out within 7 or 8 months. But I have to tell you that in my judgment, I could be dead wrong here, but in my judgment, we are on a path that could lead to a one-man government, authoritarian in nature and by definition. But I'm not sure that 50% of the American people believe that. I think that we are still living in a bit of a dream world, and we will pay a heavy price. No question in my mind about that.
what role could, should, can the news media play? And that's an expansive expression of the news media because there's so many things.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it comes up almost every single day in one way or another in whatever I'm doing. People will always say, "Okay, big shot, what will we do about it?"
Okay, big shot.
And, no, I'm serious. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And if you examine um, the world of communication today, it really is divided into two parts. There is one world that tries very hard to be proper, fair, quick, honest in the presentation of information. And I think the networks try, not cable, the networks try. I think the Times tries, the Wall Street Journal tries, the Washington Post tries. We've got some terrific newspapers and terrific networks. And we've got some terrific journalists, and they're doing the best that they can. And then there's the other half of the world of journalism, which is led by Fox and followed by quite a few sympathetically aligned radio operations, network, television operations, Sinclair, outfits of that sort feel that their responsibility is to make sure that Donald Trump and the Republican Party are reelected and reelected and reelected, so that with each election, there is a further accumulation of power. And the power then ends up inevitably in the hands not of a collective, but of one person who runs the collective. One person's name is obvious, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen.
So
This country is still a vibrant democracy. Any number of things can still happen. It is not written in the stars that we are going to end up after this November election as an authoritarian government. No, it does not follow.
So what role can the press play, given the fact that we now have AI, the demise seemingly of local news, the corpocracy that runs the media, the financial, disruption of the marketplace, social media? What role can the old mainline New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CBS, what role, if any, can they play?
They can continue to do essentially what they're doing now, but not to be afraid of what they're doing, to do what they're doing with courage, with an unafraid vision. Damn it, I'm covering the news. That's my responsibility. That is what I'm going to do. And if you don't like it, go jump in the lake. And to continue to do that, because the people who work for Fox, not all of them, some of them are totally corrupt and will do whatever the money indicates you do.
Mm-hmm.
But for a period of about 6 years, from up until 2016, for about 6 years, I did commentary for Fox Television.
Yeah, I know you worked.
Yeah, I did. Well, I mean, I did commentary. That is to say, I would go in once every week or two and do a piece. It was not a big role, whatever, but I did do these commentaries for Fox. And they never said anything to me. They never changed a word that I wrote. At the beginning in the middle of 2016, it was clear to me that they were simply doing a pro-Trump news. And I went in to see Roger Ailes, who was the head of it. And I said, "Are you doing this?" He said, "Sure. Makes a hell of a lot of money." And I said, well, then I don't want to do it with you. And I walked out. I feel good telling that story now because there is a way of dealing with that. You don't have to do what they say. You can walk out. And there are a number of reporters I know who work for Fox who would love to walk out, but can't because they need the money.
Well, yeah, I mean,
It is a very,
you were a
yes,
legend. I mean, you could afford, literally and figuratively, to walk out.
I did. That's exactly right. I was able to do that. But keep in mind, this was not my principal means of earning a living. This was a sort of a sideline thing. But you asked a very, very important question. What can journalists do? They have to continue to be courageous, unafraid, lay out the news the way you always have, and then let the rest of them catch up to you. Because you're the only people who are worth anything. You represent a free press, and a free press assures a free country. So the free press in this country has a fundamental responsibility to do what they've done. You know, if you look back in the history of this country, there have been whole periods of time when the press has not been that magnificent.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely.
But from the end of World War II until, really, I'm going to shorten this here and say the phenomenon of Trumpism, we had about 60 or 70 years when freedom reigned and democracy prospered and the press was doing a fabulous job. And to be working for somebody like Merrill, for example, you knew what he was doing with Senator McCarthy. You knew that journalists had courage to do the right thing, and they did it. And they scored big. And CBS, because of Merrill, I think, made tons of money. Mr. Paley left a very rich man. And that was not just because of Merrill, it was the whole credo. It was a way of thinking about journalism, its importance.
Well,
It has to be measured.
but this was during the American century when the world was aligned around the United States, and it was the world superpower. Today we have Putinism, we have, China. These are tremendous forces, and there's a change in the geopolitical nature of the world now. Would you agree with that? That we are,
Absolutely.
and so
I agree with what you've just said completely. I think that there is now a fundamental reordering of the world, and but we've gone through a fundamental reordering of the world when Nikita Khrushchev and Stalin and Brezhnev were running the Soviet Union. They had an awful lot of power, an awful lot of nuclear weapons, and they represented a communist system of government that, when it was hooked in with China, with its billion people, you suddenly realized that the communist world was in direct opposition to a capitalist world led by the United States. The difference now is that the leadership of the United States is being questioned by nations around the world.
yes.
And for example, the leadership right now of the Western world with respect to Ukraine, with respect to the war between Israel and Gaza and Hamas in Gaza. The United States can take a position. That does not necessarily mean any longer that the rest of the world marches along with us, because there is evidence every day that it isn't.
Right.
But the US still represents the concept of democracy. And we should all be incredibly proud of that fact. It is something no other country can do. We still can do that. And as far as I'm concerned, the sense of freedom that this country deep down continues to represent is something priceless. Some people asked me just last night, as a matter of fact, how come there are so many foreign students at American universities and so many of them are taking anti-American positions? That is true. They are.
Mhm.
That they are free to take
Right.
an anti-American position.
Right.
They are free to do that.
Here,
If they went back home
right.
in Egypt or India or Russia, wherever, they can't do that there,
Mhm.
but they can here. And so everybody is in a state of great excitement, turmoil, and depression, but what it is, and good reason too, because some of the stuff is outrageous. But you have to be free to be able to do that. And I'm ready to roll the dice and say with freedom, we're going to end up on the right side.
If you, could you go to Russia now? Have you been to Russia?
Would they let me in?
Yeah, as
Is
a
that what
reporter.
you're asking?
As a reporter, I think it would be great if you went
No,
back.
listen, I would be thrilled. But for some reason or other, my body at this point in my life gives me little signs every now and then.
Yeah, I know those sides.
Hey, buddy, you're in your 90s now, so knock it off. No, I can't for medical reasons do that, but I can assure you there isn't a day that goes by when I say to myself quietly, Marvin, wouldn't it be great if you were 40 years younger? You and I both know where the heck you'd be right now. I would be in the Middle East covering Israel. I'd be covering the Gaza war. I'd be covering Iran. I would be running all over the place as I did for 30 years of my life. I was very fortunate to be able to have those experiences. Not every reporter can. I am perfectly aware of how lucky I have been. Gets back to your earlier comment. And I'm very grateful, and I pray that this country continues to have faith in a free press, because with a free press, we're going to be okay. Without it, we're all in trouble. And I tell you something, my throat is beginning to hurt.
Okay, I
So
won't.
if you have like a question or two, I'll now wrap it up because I can't go on.
I know, I'm very, very grateful, Marvin. It's extraordinary to have you. You've had an amazing, outstanding.
No, you're being too kind.
No, it's
Thank you
amazing.
so very much for the opportunity. Seriously.
Marvin
It's
Kalb,
wonderful.
thank you
Thank
so much. It is a great pleasure and an honor. Take
God
care.
bless you.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.